In my 43 years on the bench, I have seen almost every variation of human nature imaginable. I have watched hardened criminals crumble into tears, desperate defendants negotiate for their freedom, explosions of raw, unbridled anger, and on very rare occasions, the absolute, unvarnished truth. Yet, in all those decades, I never anticipated the day a high-ranking official, a man entrusted with the city's safety, would walk into my courtroom with the specific, audacious intent of placing handcuffs on me. That day, a freezing Tuesday morning in February, is etched into my memory. It remains one of the most disgraceful incidents in the history of this courthouse. If you believe, as I do, that no one stands above the law, not even those who wear the badge and think they own the streets, then pay close attention. This is a story of what happens when unchecked arrogance meets a brick wall of judicial reality. If you want to see what true accountability looks like, you are exactly where you need to be. My morning had begun like any other, 4 or 5 a.m. I stepped into my courtroom, clutching a cup of hot coffee in one hand and the worn, leather folder my father gave me on the day I took my oath as a judge in the other. It was a ritual of focus, a moment of preparation before the chaos of the docket began. But as I opened the doors, I sensed the air was heavy, charged with a strange, suffocating static. The room was unusually crowded. Every seat was occupied, and people were standing shoulder to shoulder along the back walls. That alone should have been my first warning that something explosive was about to unfold. As I settled into my chair, my clerk, Sandra, caught my attention. She moved toward the bench, her face pale, leaning in to whisper that we had a special, unscheduled matter that morning, case number 7349. I reviewed the docket and I paused. The name hit me like a physical blow. Commissioner James Sterling, 52 years old, charged with contempt of court and blatant obstruction of justice. Contempt cases are rarely complex, usually. Someone ignores a court order or forgets their place, but this was different. This was the Providence Police Commissioner, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the city. He stood before the bench with an air of practiced entitlement. He wore a navy suit that cost more than my first car. His tie was knotted with the precision of a man who never expected to hear the word no, and on his wrist, a Rolex Presidential caught the dim courtroom lights, flashing with every calculated movement. He wore his wealth and his title like a shield, clearly expecting the entire room to bow. Beside him stood a defense attorney whose reputation for shielding the powerful preceded him. The silence in the room was absolute, but it wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of people watching a collision they knew was coming. I turned my attention to the prosecution table. Standing there was Assistant District Attorney Lisa Chen. She was 34 years old, 6 years into her tenure with the DA's office, and arguably one of the sharpest legal minds I had encountered in years. Yet, that morning, her demeanor was uncharacteristically fragile. Her hands hovered nervously over her documents, and despite the air conditioning humming in the back, I saw a light sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. That was the first sign the silence in the room was not just respectful, it was fearful. This case went far deeper than a simple charge of obstruction. It was a powder keg, and she knew it. I commanded the room to order and instructed Miss Chen to explain exactly why the city's top law enforcement official was appearing before me as a defendant. She inhaled deeply, her voice trembling for a split second before she summoned the strength of her office. According to her, 3 weeks earlier, on January 14th, at approximately 2:30 inches the afternoon, Commissioner Sterling had allegedly interfered in an active criminal investigation. She alleged that he had weaponized his position of power, using intimidation and direct pressure to silence officers who were simply doing their duty. The reason? The case involved his own nephew. That detail sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Lisa continued, her voice gaining steel. His nephew, 3-year-old Brandon Sterling, had been arrested on charges of assault and battery. The victim was Michael Torres, a 4-year-old military veteran who had completed 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan. Michael had returned home carrying the invisible scars of war, PTSD, and a permanent leg injury that left him with a noticeable, painful limp. Despite those challenges, he worked as a hospital security guard to provide for his wife and 3 children. His youngest daughter, only 7 years old, was fighting for her life in that very same hospital, undergoing treatment for leukemia. According to the police report, the confrontation took place outside a bar on Westminster Street around 11:20 p.m. Michael had just finished a double shift and was heading home, exhausted. Brandon Sterling, on the other hand, had spent the night in a haze of alcohol. Later evidence showed his Instagram account was filled with videos of him partying, flashing thick stacks of cash, and bragging to his followers that his uncle was powerful enough to make any legal problem vanish into thin air. The encounter was a tragedy of circumstance. Michael accidentally brushed against Brandon while walking down the crowded sidewalk. Michael, the kind of man who would apologize to the door if he bumped into it, offered a polite, "Excuse me." But Brandon wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for a target. Eyewitnesses reported that he began mocking the veteran's limp, spitting out degrading names, and eventually shoving Michael to the ground. Michael tried to walk away. He wanted no part of this, but Brandon continued the harassment, following him, pushing him, and eventually throwing a flurry of punches until the veteran collapsed, unconscious. Michael was rushed to the hospital with a fractured jaw, 3 broken ribs, and severe trauma to his leg. Brandon was arrested that night. The evidence, surveillance footage, eyewitness statements, and his own digital bragging was airtight. It should have been an open and shut case. But that was before the commissioner decided the law didn't apply to his bloodline. The commissioner didn't just walk into the precinct, he occupied it. At 1:15 a.m., he stormed into the station, his presence instantly silencing the room. He didn't ask for an update on the booking. He issued a command. He demanded that his nephew Brandon be released immediately. When the desk sergeant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directive, the commissioner's mask of calm, calculated authority slipped away. His tone shifted from authoritative to predatory. He wasn't suggesting an error in procedure. He was issuing threats that carried the weight of a professional death sentence. He told those officers, good, hard-working men and women, that their careers were over. He promised them, with terrifying clarity, that they would never wear a badge in this city again if they didn't erase the incident from the records. The officer on the receiving end of this tirade was Patricia Morales. She was a single mother of 2, a woman who had poured 9 years of her life into the Providence Police Department. Her record was pristine, not a single disciplinary mark, a standard bearer for integrity, and someone currently being considered for a well-deserved promotion. She stood there, trembling, knowing exactly what was at stake. She understood that in the world of high-level politics, the truth is often a commodity that can be bought or buried. She knew that if she refused, it would be her word against the commissioners, and she was acutely aware of which side carried the weight of institutional influence. But Commissioner Sterling made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the moral fiber of the person he was trying to intimidate. While he stood there, spewing vitriol and promising to destroy her future, Patricia Morales didn't crumble. She did the only thing she could. She reached into her pocket and silently activated the voice recorder on her phone. For 8 uninterrupted minutes, she let him dig his own grave. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of professional stoicism, while he detailed exactly how he intended to manufacture evidence to put in her locker, how he would ruin her professional reputation, and how he would ensure she was blackballed from law enforcement. He laid out his corruption as if it were a standard business practice. He didn't just threaten her, he insulted the very badge he was sworn to uphold. When he finally finished, convinced he had broken her, he walked out of that station with the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. He didn't know that the 8 minutes of audio she held in her hand were not just evidence, they were his resignation, his conviction, and his undoing. The moment the doors swung shut behind him, Patricia didn't go home to cry. She drove straight to the district attorney's office. I looked down at the commissioner, who was sitting with his legs crossed, checking his watch as if he had somewhere far more important to be. The arrogance was palpable. It wasn't just a lack of respect for my courtroom. It was a fundamental disbelief that he could ever be subject to the same consequences as the people he swore to protect. When I gestured for the defense to proceed, his attorney, Marcus Webb, stood with a theatrical flourish. He didn't address the substance of the charges. He didn't even try to deny the incident at the precinct. Instead, he dismissed the entire mountain-sized stack of evidence as a misunderstanding. He painted the commissioner's actions, the threats, the coercion, the blatant abuse of power, as nothing more than a father's concerned attempt to ensure his nephew was treated fairly. He spun a narrative where the police department was actually the villain and his client was merely a victim of a coordinated, politically motivated attack orchestrated by the district attorney's office. It was a classic deflection. Attack the process when you cannot defend the facts. I listened to his words, letting them hang in the air, the kind of polished, expensive nonsense that usually passes for a legal defense in high-stakes cases. But here, in my courtroom, I had no patience for smoke and mirrors. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish his little speech about political vendettas. I wanted it on the record, exactly what the defense was hanging their hat on. When he finally sat down, clearly pleased with his own performance, I didn't offer a rebuttal. I simply looked at Assistant District Attorney Lisa Chen and said, "Miss Chen, you mentioned an audio recording in your opening statement. Play it." The look on Commissioner Sterling's face shifted. For the first time, the boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation, then a hard, defensive glare. He turned to his lawyer, but it was too late. Lisa Chen calmly walked to the evidence table and connected her device to the courtroom's audio system. There was a brief moment of electronic feedback, and then the courtroom was filled with his voice. It wasn't the voice of a man defending his nephew. It was the cold, calculated voice of a man who thought he owned the law. The recording was crystal clear. It captured the exact moment he threatened Officer Morales. It was undeniable. He didn't just suggest she drop the case. He explicitly outlined how he would destroy her career, how he would plant evidence in her locker, and how he would turn her life into a professional nightmare if she didn't comply. There was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding, just the raw, ugly sound of a man misusing his office to commit a crime. The silence that followed the end of the recording was deafening. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that precedes a storm. Every person in that courtroom, from the court reporter to the bailiff, was stunned by the sheer brazenness of the commissioner's recorded words. He had outlined in cold, precise detail exactly how he would dismantle Officer Morales' life if she didn't bend to his will. I turned my gaze toward Commissioner Sterling. I expected him to look ashamed, perhaps even cornered. Instead, he smiled. It was a cold, dismissive smirk, the kind worn by a man who has never been told no in his entire life. He stood up, adjusted his expensive cuffs, and declared that he stood by every single word on that tape. He claimed that Officer Morales was his subordinate and that she was expected to follow his instructions without a moment's hesitation. He insisted, with an eerie lack of self-awareness, that as commissioner, he possessed the absolute authority to decide which criminal investigations moved forward and which ones were buried. He wasn't defending himself. He was asserting his right to be a tyrant. I leaned back in my chair, allowing his statement to hang in the air, ensuring every person in that gallery fully absorbed what he had just admitted. He had openly confessed to witness intimidation, interference in a criminal prosecution, and total disregard for the law, and he had done so with a sickening amount of pride. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Assistant District Attorney Lisa Chen and asked if she had more. She didn't say a word. She simply lifted a massive stack of documents from beneath the table and placed them before the court. The thud was audible. She explained that after Officer Morales stepped forward, the dam had broken. 3 other officers had come forward independently, all painting the same picture of a department rotting from the inside out. They described a hidden, systemic layer of protection reserved exclusively for the wealthy, the politically connected, and the commissioner's inner circle. The documents included sworn affidavits and internal emails spanning 5 years. They outlined at least 15 separate incidents where the commissioner had either sabotaged an investigation or retaliated against an officer for refusing an unlawful order. As the reality of the evidence sank in, I shifted my focus back to Sterling. The smirk was gone. His face had flushed a deep, ugly shade of red, and his jaw was locked tight, vibrating with suppressed fury. He couldn't handle the loss of control. He rose to his feet, ignoring his own lawyer's frantic attempts to pull him down, and pointed a finger directly at me. He told me, with venom dripping from his lips, that I was operating far beyond my station. He dismissed me as a small-town traffic judge who got lucky on the internet. He insisted that I lacked the standing to judge a man of his stature, claiming that using power to protect family was the very reason that power existed. Sterling didn't stop there. He wasn't just losing his composure, he was unraveling, and in doing so, he made the single greatest mistake of his life. He decided that if he couldn't intimidate the court with his authority, he would attempt to dismantle it with his ego. He turned his attention from the evidence directly to me. He dismissed my role as a judge entirely, labeling me a television personality dressed in costume. According to him, I was merely a performer, a small-town traffic judge who had gained popularity through a screen, possessing no genuine influence over a man of his stature. The courtroom fell into an uneasy, jagged silence. You could feel the collective gasp of the gallery. He wasn't just arguing a case anymore. He was launching a personal crusade. Then, he crossed a line that I have never, in over 40 years on the bench, allowed to go unanswered. He began to sneer at my heritage. He mocked my background, reminding the room that my father was an Italian immigrant who spent his entire life working long hours in a factory. He called me a blue-collar kid who was merely pretending to belong in rooms designed for people like him. It was a cold, calculated attempt to diminish me, to reduce my life's work to the status of a prop. He wanted to make me feel small. He wanted to remind me of where I came from, as if the sacrifice of a man who worked 16-hour days to build a future for his children was something to be ashamed of. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. I had endured insults from angry litigants for decades. I've been called every name in the book by people far more desperate and far less entitled than James Sterling. But this wasn't about me. This was an attack on the very integrity of the people who built this country on the backs of hard, honest work. The room grew heavy, the air thinning as the realization set in. He had finally gone too far. He looked at me, waiting for me to flinch, waiting for me to be offended by the suggestion that I was just a working-class kid. Instead, I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I simply rose from my chair, the movement deliberate and slow. The gavel, which had been resting quietly, suddenly felt like a weapon. The commissioner's arrogant posture faltered for a fraction of a second as he realized that the person he was insulting was the only person standing between him and total destruction. I stood up slowly, the silence in the courtroom becoming heavy, almost physical. My father did not come to this country with nothing, laboring 16-hour days in a factory so that his daughter could be lectured on status by a man whose only claim to power was a badge he had clearly stained. I met Sterling's eyes, and for a fleeting second, his mask of untouchability cracked. I told him to sit down and remain silent. I didn't need to shout. The authority of the bench was enough. His attorney, finally realizing the trap his client had walked into, grabbed Sterling's arm and guided him back into his chair. "Lisa," I said, my voice cold and steady, "is there more?" She didn't speak. She simply hit a button, and the massive courtroom monitor flickered to life. The first image was a screenshot from the commissioner's own personal Instagram. There he sat, in an exclusive private club, glass of whiskey in hand, flanked by 2 city council members and a state senator. The caption read, "Another productive week looking after our interests. Most people don't understand how things really work." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lisa advanced to the next image, a private message conversation between Sterling and his nephew. Brandon admitted to the assault, acknowledging the severity of the veteran's injuries. The commissioner's response was chilling. "Don't worry, everything will be handled." He referred to Michael Torres, a decorated hero who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, as unimportant. That word hung in the air like a stain. But Lisa wasn't done. She displayed an exchange where Brandon fretted that the female officer handling the case wouldn't back down. Sterling's reply was a death sentence for a career. "I'll handle her personally. I'll destroy everything she's built." Then, the final piece of digital evidence hit the room like a hammer. It was a public TikTok video posted by Brandon just 3 days earlier. He was at a party, surrounded by expensive liquor, laughing as he danced. The caption mocked the victim. "When you put someone in the hospital and your uncle makes it disappear, money and power, baby. Rules are for everyone else." And there, in the comments, was the verified account of Commissioner James Sterling. "That's my nephew. Family comes first. We don't live by the same rules as everyone else." The commissioner's face went ash gray. He tried to stammer that his accounts were hacked, that it was a setup, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew the digital forensic trail was absolute. Lisa confirmed that every device had been traced back to his personal registry. Just as the courtroom was reeling from the social media reveal, the rear doors swung open. 2 federal agents walked in, accompanied by an assistant United States attorney. They didn't come to observe, they came to collect. The commissioner was now a federal target for racketeering, money laundering, and systemic corruption. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was the final station for a man who had forgotten that a badge is a tool for service, not a license to plunder. As the bailiffs moved in, the transformation in Sterling was visceral. The man who had walked in with the swagger of a king was now hunched, his eyes darting around the room, desperately seeking a lifeline that no longer existed. I didn't waste words. I sentenced him to 1 full year in county jail, effective immediately, with no bail. But prison was merely the beginning of his accountability. I ordered him to provide full financial restitution to Officer Patricia Morales for the professional hell he had put her through, and to cover every single medical expense Michael Torres had incurred as a result of the assault his nephew committed. However, incarceration alone wasn't sufficient for a man who treated human lives like pawns on a chessboard. I imposed a condition I had never included in a sentence before. Upon his release, he was to complete 1,000 hours of community service, and it wouldn't be performed at a desk or in an administrative office. He was to serve those hours at the very VA hospital where Michael Torres worked. Day after day, he would work alongside the veterans he had once dismissed as unimportant. He would be forced to witness the resilience and the quiet dignity of the men and women he had treated with such callous disregard. He would have to come face to face with the reality that his wealth and his influence were dust in the wind compared to the service and sacrifice of people like Michael. As Officer Morales escorted him toward the exit, Sterling paused. He looked back at the bench one final time. Something in his eyes had finally shifted. For the first time, it seemed the weight of reality had reached him. He realized that he wasn't above the law, he was finally subject to it. I then turned to the courtroom, to the citizens who had witnessed this collapse of privilege. I told them that what they had seen was not a miracle, it was the system working exactly as it was intended to work. But it only functions when people have the courage to defend it. It functions when officers like Patricia Morales refuse to be intimidated, when prosecutors like Lisa Chen stand firm against enormous pressure, and when leaders like Chief Rizzo choose integrity over the comforts of corruption. I called Michael Torres forward. He approached the bench, his limp, a visible reminder of what he had endured. I looked him in the eye and told him, on behalf of the city, that I was sorry. I assured him that the city would handle his daughter's medical expenses, and I would personally ensure she had access to the best care available. Michael broke down not in defeat, but in relief. He admitted he never thought justice would reach a man like him. 2 weeks later, the feds officially arrested Sterling on federal charges, racketeering, money laundering, and grand-scale corruption. He now faced decades in a federal penitentiary. His nephew, stripped of his uncle's shield, pleaded guilty and received a 3-year sentence. Officer Morales was promoted to sergeant and eventually lieutenant. Chief Rizzo became the new commissioner, dedicated to purging the rot from the department. And Michael? He is still working at that hospital, his daughter in remission, a symbol of the fact that no title is bigger than the truth. Remember this: power is fleeting, but character and the consequences of your choices is what remains.